What's up, everybody? Welcome back to John's Fantasy Football Show. That's John. I'm Jared, and boy, oh boy, do we have a show for you. If you like fantasy football, you're going to love this episode because it is playoff time. And you think, oh, it's week 10. Why are we talking about playoffs? This is when you win your league, John. Am I wrong?
No, you're completely right.
This is when you make your trades, you make your moves, you pick up the waiver wire, and you look at those playoff matchups, and that way you can win your fantasy football league. This is when the leagues are won. So you're in for a treat today. John, start us off. We're basically going to go through each position, 5 players that you like, 2 players that you don't like. So we got to start off with the most important position, right? Quarterback.
Right. Exactly. So I just want to start off and say thank you guys for listening. And if this is the only podcast you've heard of my fantasy football podcast, then you are in for a treat. I think if there's one podcast that you need to hear and you need to watch and listen to, it's this one, because this podcast is going to help you win your fantasy leagues. And like Jared said, yes, it is time to actually think about the fantasy playoffs. It's actually not that far away. We're only 6 or 7 weeks away from it. So this is the time before the trade deadline is up in your fantasy leagues to go out, extend offers to teams in your league, and try to make sure that you have the best starting lineup possible for the fantasy playoffs and your players have the best matchups of any other team in the league. So this is the time to trade away those bench players because you're not going to need the depth anymore. If you have receivers on your bench that you're not going to use the rest of the year, throw them in a deal and try to upgrade your starting lineup. You want those players, those 8 players or whatever it is, to be the best 8 players that you can find in the league. So like Jared said, I'm going to go through each position. I'm going to give 5 players that I like for the fantasy playoffs, which for most people, it's going to be week 16 and week 17 of the NFL season. So week 18 is left out because some teams, if they have a bye in the playoff, they're going to rest their players. So fantasy football doesn't want to deal with that. But some teams or some leagues do have week 15 playoffs as well. So I'll mention a couple week 15 matchups as I go through the names, but I'm going to be focusing mainly on week 16, which is the semifinals, and week 17, which is the fantasy football finals. So without further ado, let's go into the quarterbacks. So the 5 quarterbacks, the first one I like for the fantasy football playoffs is Joe Burrow. So in week 16, he plays the Baltimore Ravens and he's at home. And the Ravens give up the 13th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And Burrow, we saw put up 41 points on the Ravens just recently, and he had 28 fantasy points in that game. So I like Burrow there. And then in week 17, he's also at home again, and he plays the Chiefs, who give up the 2nd most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And obviously, we've seen how the Chiefs have been playing. Even if they turn it around, their defense has still been struggling. And I really like Burrow. Those are 2 great matchups for him, and they're both at home. The second guy is Justin Herbert. He's at the Texans in week 16. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. He should have no problem with the Texans. And then he's at home against the Broncos. It is a divisional matchup, and the Broncos do give up the 2nd least fantasy points to quarterbacks, but I still like it because he is at home. The Chargers put up 30 points last year against the Broncos in the first time they played them, and then the second time the Chargers put up 19 points. So they don't struggle a whole lot with them. So I would be confident if you had Herbert right now. Number 3 is Tom Brady. He plays the Panthers in week 16, who give up the 26th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So not a lot. They actually give up like the 6th least fantasy points to quarterbacks. But I would not be concerned with this matchup because last year, again, divisional rival, the Bucs played the Panthers twice. They put up 46 points and 31 points. So I would not be concerned about Brady putting up points against the Panthers. And then week 17, they play the Jets, who are going to struggle against the Buccaneers. Brady should have a big game both of those weeks. So if you have Brady, definitely keep him on your fantasy team. Number 4, Aaron Rodgers. He plays the Browns in week 16, give up the 11th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And then against the Vikings at home in week 17, they give up the 15th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And last year, Rodgers and the Packers put up 43 points against the Vikings the first time they played them, and 22 points in the second meeting. So I would not be worried about Rodgers, especially because we know Rodgers, he always plays better when he's at home, and week 16 and 17, he's at home against the Browns and the Vikings. So great matchups there in situation for Rodgers. And the last guy is Kyler Murray. He plays the Colts at home in week 16. The Colts give up the third most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And then in week 17, he's at the Cowboys. They give up the sixth most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And actually, last year when the Cowboys and the Cardinals played, the Cardinals put up 38 points on the Cowboys, and Kyler Murray had 29 fantasy points. So if you have Kyler Murray, you should feel pretty good about where you're sitting for the fantasy playoffs. But obviously, you want to keep an eye on that ankle injury. We saw he didn't play last week, might not play this week. You might want to get another quarterback on your roster, maybe one of the other four that I mentioned. But if assuming Kyler comes back healthy and he's healthy for the fantasy football playoffs, you should be in good shape. So now, two players that I don't like for the fantasy football playoffs. The first is Lamar Jackson. In week 16, he plays at the Cincinnati Bengals. They give up the 19th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, so actually the 13th fewest. And the Lamar Jackson had 23 fantasy points when they played the Bengals a few weeks ago, so not horrible, but I don't expect Lamar to have a great game. And then in week 17, he gets an even tougher matchup. He plays the Los Angeles Rams, who give up the seventh or eighth most or eighth least fantasy points to quarterbacks. So Lamar Jackson has a really tough playoff schedule. If you want, I would be fine with you trading away Lamar Jackson for Kyler Murray, for Aaron Rodgers, for Joe Burrow, for Tom Brady, or for Justin Herbert right now. Or I know, Jared, you have Lamar in our league, and Burrow, I think, is available. So I would be happy with you trading away Lamar, seeing what you can get, and then roll with Burrow the rest of the year, because you also have Hurts. So, like, you don't really, like, what's the margin of Lamar? Like, how much better is Lamar going to do than Burrow the rest of the year? Like, not that much better. And especially if Burrow has better playoff matchups and you want to get into that last spot, that could be the difference between you getting to the finals or not. And then the last quarterback I dislike, the second one, is Kirk Cousins. He plays against the Rams in week 16, eighth fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. And then he plays at the Packers in week 17. They give up the seventh least fantasy points to quarterbacks. And I just wanted to mention a couple other names while you guys are asking about some top guys. Josh Allen, I don't like or I don't dislike. He plays at the Patriots in week 16, which is not a great matchup for him. But then he does play at home against the Falcons in week 17. So I really like him for the fantasy football finals. And if you have Josh Allen, I wouldn't be mad with you picking up Matt Ryan right now, right? He plays the Lions in week 16 at home, give up the 14th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And I see that Falcons-Lions game being pretty high scoring. But then Ryan plays the Bills in week 17, so you're not going to want to start him there. But if you have Josh Allen, you could pick up Matt Ryan, maybe put him in for that week 16 game because he has a much better matchup against the Lions than Allen does against the Patriots. And then when it gets to week 17, if you make the fantasy football finals, you put in Josh Allen. And then Dak Prescott, I like, but I don't love. He plays home against Washington, home against the Cardinals in the fantasy football playoffs. So good matchups, but not great. They are good that they're both at home. So if you have Dak, I wouldn't worry too much.
Quick question. I have in my other league, a 12-man league, I have Daniel Jones as the backup, and he's got really good matchups: Cowboys, Eagles, Bears to end out the season.
Right.
Would you overlook the matchups because he's just so inconsistent?
Yeah. I mean, so he's your backup, right? Who's your starter then?
Dak.
Dak. Yeah. So in that case, if you have Dak, I would be fine with that. He plays at home against Washington in week 16, Cardinals in week 17 at home. I wouldn't consider putting Daniel Jones, especially because it's just too risky. I mean, against Washington, maybe, but against the Bears in the fantasy football finals, I wouldn't even consider that because I think he's away in that game. He's at the Bears.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just in Chicago in January. It's going to be tough for Daniel Jones to have a great game. So I would be fine with you even dropping Daniel Jones because I think the Cowboys already had their bye. So unless Dak gets hurt or misses a game, you're not going to need Daniel Jones the rest of the year. But yeah, I see what you're saying there. I do like Dak enough to keep him in for both those games.
Interesting. Okay. All right. We're done with the quarterbacks. So let's go on to running backs. A lot tougher to decide.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. And I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you guys. Throwing out matchups, throwing out, what they've they played against this team the last time. But don't be afraid to pause the video, or go extend trade offers, or come back to this video and whenever you get your trade offers and you're deciding. But as far as running backs, there's a lot to talk about. Now, what I want to do for running backs, I don't want to talk about the top guys, because if you have like McCaffrey, if you have Kamara, Cook, Saquon, Eckler, Jonathan Taylor, you're not really going to trade away these guys for the guys that I'm going to say that have good matchups. Because if you have Kamara, Cook, all those guys that I said, you're not, basically they're kind of matchup proof. They could maybe have 15 points instead of 20, but you're starting them no matter what because they're must starts. So I wouldn't worry too much. Out of McCaffrey, Kamara, Cook, Saquon, Eckler, and Taylor, I will say that two of them I like better than the others. I like Kamara because he plays against Miami and Carolina in the fantasy football playoffs. And then Taylor plays Arizona and Las Vegas. So good matchups for them too, better than the other three that I mentioned. But again, if you have those five, you're starting them no matter what. So these players, I'm going to list five that I really like for the fantasy football playoffs. They're lower tier guys, maybe tier 2 guys, RB2s, solid RB2s that you could actually go and trade for, because I want to say guys that you guys can actually go trade for in your leagues. So the first one is DeAndre Swift. Week 16, he plays the Atlanta Falcons, give up the 6th most fantasy points to running backs. And then week 17, he plays the Seahawks, 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Those games, the Lions, every time the Lions play the Falcons and the Seahawks, you could just tell that's going to be a high scoring game. Both of those defenses, the Lions defense and the Falcons and the Seahawks, they've all been struggling. So you could tell that both those games against the Falcons and Seahawks, they're going to be over 20 points. And I see Swift being the focal point of that offense and getting at least, 15 to 20 fantasy points in those games. The second guy is David Montgomery. He plays at the Seahawks in week 16. That's 3rd most fantasy points to running backs. And then against the Giants in week 17, they give up the 7th most fantasy points to running backs. So I like Montgomery coming off that injury. Herbert didn't do well. Damian Williams is not even a factor anymore. The Bears seem like they want to give the workhorse load to Montgomery, so I would not be worried about any other backs mixing in, and I like his playoff matchups. Number 3 is Joe Mixon. He plays the Ravens in week 16. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to running backs. And Mixon, they played the Ravens a few weeks ago. He did only have 12 fantasy points in that game, but the Ravens defense has been struggling. They've given up so many yards. I think it's the worst statistical defense of the Ravens in a John Harbaugh system. But I think that the Bengals, like I said, I like Burrow. They're going to be able to move the ball against the Ravens. And anytime a team is able to move the ball through the air, the run game is going to get going, and Mixon could punch in a couple, touchdowns inside the 5-yard line. So I do like him there. And then he gets the Chiefs in week 17. And I also like him there because the Chiefs defense has been struggling. They give up the 16th most fantasy points to running backs. Number 4 is Darrell Henderson. In week 16, he plays the Vikings. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to running backs. And then in week 17, he plays the Ravens. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to running backs. And also, if your league plays a matchup in week 15 for the playoffs, in week 15, he gets the Seahawks, who give up the 3rd most fantasy points to running back. So another good matchup for Henderson. And then the last guy is Leonard Fournette. He plays at the Panthers in week 16. They give up the 3rd least amount of fantasy points to running backs. Now, you might be saying, well, John, then why would you choose him to be one of the guys that you like if the Panthers give up the 3rd least fantasy points to running backs? Well, here's why. The Panthers' run defense has improved since last season, but I'm still not buying the complete hype on them. I think they've played some easy matchups. They did hold Kamara to only a few points, but I still like Fournette, and here's why. Last year, the Bucs scored 46 points against the Panthers in one week, 31 in the other week. And in the one they scored 31 points, Fournette had over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns in that game. And then the other game, when they scored 46 points, Ronald Jones had over 120 yards and a touchdown. But Ronald Jones is not a factor this year. So Fournette's going to be the lead guy in both of those games. And I think against the Panthers and the Bucs, they're going to just destroy the Panthers. So I think Fournette's going to have a big game there. And then in week 17, he has the ultimate easy matchup. It's against the Jets. The Jets' run defense has been horrible. We saw what Jonathan Taylor did to them last Thursday night. The Jets give up the most fantasy points to running backs. So if you guys can, try to get one of these 5 players on your team, and I really do like Fournette. And a couple of guys that I dislike. The first is Nick Chubb. I know you guys, he had a great game this past week, but I think it's a perfect time to trade him away. Unfortunately, he did get COVID. He might not play this week against the Patriots, but Hunt is going to be back in a few weeks. And especially for the fantasy football playoffs, Hunt will be back. Dearness Johnson probably won't cut into Chubb's usage too much, but Chubb does play the Packers in week 16. That they give up the 13th fewest fantasy points to running backs. And then he plays at the Steelers in week 17 for the fantasy football finals. They give up the third fewest fantasy points to running backs. And actually, Chubb played the Steelers a couple weeks ago in week 8, and he only had 7.9 fantasy points. So I would really try to trade away Nick Chubb if you have him and you're looking like you're going to make the fantasy football playoffs. And then the second guy is Josh Jacobs. I don't love him because he plays the Broncos in week 16. They give up the 7th or 8th least fantasy points to running backs. And Jacobs actually did play the Broncos in week 6. He had 15.2 fantasy points. So, okay. But Drake is being more and more involved into this offense and getting a lot of the catches out of the backfield. So Jacobs doesn't seem like he's going to have a 30-point game this season, and his ceiling is capped by Drake's involvement. And then in week 17, Jacobs plays the Colts, who give up the second least fantasy points to running backs. So I don't like Chubb or Jacobs for the fantasy football playoffs.
Okay, very, very interesting. Now, for the running back situation, I guess we'll move to the wide receivers, but I guess this is a question for after the fact. Like, which position do you feel is more important when looking at the playoffs? Like, would you rather have the running back solidified, or would you rather have the receiver solidified? Is it harder to get running backs off waivers than it is to get a receiver off waivers?
Yeah, it definitely is tougher to get the running backs off waivers or free agency. But my philosophy with fantasy football, and I think I've mentioned this before, but it's always the most important position. And this is my advice is given off PPR leagues. So I always play PPR leagues. I think they're better, but I think that in fantasy football, the most important position is the wide receivers. And that's because they get the most points. Like last year, we saw Davante Adams had the most fantasy points of any other receiver, and he had more fantasy points than any quarterback and than any running back. And like we've been talking about, there's a big difference between the best receiver in the league and the 20th best receiver in the league. There's a big fantasy point difference. But if you take the quarterback, the number 1 quarterback and the number 20 quarterback, there's not that much of a difference. So you can get away with having a little worse quarterback, but you really need to solidify those wide receivers. And you could tell by looking at my fantasy teams, I always make sure that I have the best receivers that I can get for the playoffs and for the whole season. So I'd say that receivers are even more important than running backs in this situation.
Yeah, like in our 6-man, I'm so reluctant to give up these top receivers because
Right.
they have the chance to blow up, like Tyreek Hill.
Exactly.
Like, they have the chance to get 30, 40 points a week. Granted, they may not get targeted and may get 8,
Right.
but those 30 or 40 points save me in a lot of the weeks. So
Yeah.
even though I'm down one running back, I don't really have a running back 2. It's like it's kind of worth it to keep, a receiver on the bench. It's interesting. Like this week, Jamar Chase is on a bye, so I have to put in Justin Jefferson.
Right.
So I have a top receiver right on my bench to replace him with, rather
Exactly.
than trying to stream one. But let's take a look at the receivers. So let's start off with your 5 that you like.
Yeah. So I think you're going to be happy about this first one. I think this might be one of the most important players actually going into the fantasy football playoffs. It's Deebo Samuel. I can't
That's
stress,
why you wanted him.
that's why I did.
Sneaky.
I was doing my research and I sent Jared a trade for Deebo Samuel and he quickly rejected it.
I was wondering, I'm like, he's injured right now. Like, Ayuk's coming back. I'm like, why the heck does he want him? That's
So
funny.
I can't stress enough how good the matchups are for Deebo Samuel the rest of the year. He doesn't play a team the rest of the season from here on out, the last 8 games of the season or 9 games. He doesn't play a team that ranks like 13th or or less in fantasy points against. So he always plays teams that give up either 14th or more than that in the league. So either way, great matchups. So Deebo Samuel, week 15, I do want to say he plays the Falcons. Obviously, that's going to be a high scoring game. Falcons can't stop anybody on the outside. They give up the 15th most fantasy points to wide receivers. Week 16, Deebo Samuel, fantasy football semifinals, plays the Tennessee Titans, give up the most fantasy points to receivers. And then week 17, he gets the Texans. Texans can't stop anybody on the outside. They give up the 14th most fantasy points to wide receivers. So Deebo Samuel, if you have him, definitely keep him. If you don't have him, maybe try to trade for him if the owners weren't willing to budge. Number 2 is Amari Cooper. They play in week 16. The Cowboys play the Washington football team. They give up the second most fantasy points to wide receivers and the second most fantasy points to receivers that line up out wide. So that's why I favor Amari Cooper in this situation over CeeDee Lamb, because Washington does give up almost all of their fantasy points to receivers that line up out wide. And then in week 17, Amari Cooper gets the Cardinals. The Cardinals should be able to put up points. That's going to be a high-scoring game with them and the Cardinals, the Cowboys and Cardinals. They give up the 18th most fantasy points to wide receivers, so not that much, but they actually give up the 5th most fantasy points to receivers that line up out wide. So that's why I like Amari Cooper for both of these games, even though the matchup in terms of fantasy points might not look great, but in terms of where they line up, Amari Cooper should have good games in both of those weeks. Number 3, I talked about it a few weeks ago, DeAndre Hopkins. I know he's injured right now. He's got that hamstring injury. I have him in one of my 12-team leagues. I think he's going to come back in a few weeks and be healthy. I wouldn't try to trade him away because he doesn't have much value right now. But if you don't have him, it would be a good time to trade for him because the team that has him is probably frustrated with his injury and doesn't know if he's going to come back healthy. So it would be a good time to get Hopkins on your team, get him at a buy low value. But in week 16, he plays the Colts. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. Number 4th most fantasy points to receivers that line up out wide. And then in week 17, they play the Cowboys, 9th most fantasy points to wide receivers, and actually the most fantasy points to receivers that line up out wide. And that might be surprising with Trevon Diggs there, but it's actually true. Trevon Diggs does get interceptions, but he actually does let up a lot of yards and a lot of fantasy points. So fire up Hopkins in all your leagues. If you don't have him, now would be a great time to trade for him. Number 4 is DK Metcalf. He plays the Bears in week 16. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And then in week 17, he plays the Lions. They actually give up the 21st most fantasy points to wide receivers. So actually the 12th least, but they give up the 9th most to receivers that line up out wide like DK does. And with Russell Wilson coming back, I think it's a great time to trade for DK Metcalf if you can. And then number 5, I just said his name by accident, but DJ Moore. I've been talking about him. I know you guys might be worried because Sam Darnold is out. The Panthers signed Cam Newton, which you guys probably saw, but I actually like DJ Moore moving forward, and especially for the fantasy football playoffs. In week 16, he plays the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers secondary has been banged up. They give up the 11th most fantasy points to receivers and the 3rd most to receivers that line up out wide. And in 2 games last year against the Buccaneers, DJ Moore had 20 points and 19.6 fantasy points. So he's consistently good. He's going to beat his projection in week 16. And then in week 17, he plays the Saints, who give up the 4th most fantasy points to receivers. And DJ Moore played them twice last year. He had 25.3 points in the first game, 15.1 points in the second game last year. And then earlier this season, when the Panthers played the Saints, DJ Moore had 21.9 fantasy points. So DJ Moore in these divisional games always takes advantage of these cornerbacks. So I really like DJ Moore moving forward and in the fantasy football playoffs. So try to trade for him if you can, because the owner right now probably isn't too high on DJ Moore with PJ Walker starting this week, Cam Newton coming in, and Darnold out for a few weeks. So it's a good buy low opportunity for DJ Moore. And then 2 guys that I don't like. The first is Brandon Cooks. He plays the Chargers in week 16. They give up the 2nd least fantasy points to wide receivers. And then he plays at the 49ers in week 17. They give up the 10th least fantasy points to wide receivers. So even though Tyrod Taylor's back, I don't think Cooks is going to have great playoff matchups. So I would be fine with you trading away Cooks while everybody else is high on him. And then the last guy, Jared, you're not going to be happy with this one, but it's Justin Jefferson. And you're going to agree with me once you hear his matchups. In week 16, he plays the Los Angeles Rams. Again, he lines up outside for the most part. Thielen usually lines up more in the slot. So he's probably going to be matched up with Ramsey. They give up the 19th most fantasy points to wide receivers, so actually 13th least. And then in week 17, he plays against the Packers. They give up the 5th least fantasy points to receivers and most likely lined up with Jair Alexander. And you might ask, well, Vikings, Packers, same division. What happened when Jefferson played the Packers last season? Well, he played the Packers twice. In the first game, he had 4.6 fantasy points. In the second game, he had 5.6 fantasy points. So I don't see Jefferson beating his projection either of the week 16 or week 17. So if you have Justin Jefferson, I would be fine with you trading him straight up for one of the 5 players I mentioned before, if you can get any of them.
I've been trying to trade him, to be honest with you, forever.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily need him. I just need him for this bye week because Jamar Chase is on a bye.
Right. Then you can get rid of him.
Exactly. I guess the question that a lot of people are having because of the most recent news, OBJ. Now, Robert Woods has been the wide receiver 2 for the Rams. Do you see that changing at all with OBJ coming in? Do you think OBJ is a viable option for the playoffs?
I don't think so. And I'm going to look up their matchups right now because I know they play the Vikings. Like I just said, the Vikings play them. So they play the Vikings in week 16. They give up the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers. Then they play Baltimore. They give up the 8th least fantasy points to receivers. So I really wouldn't trade for OBJ. A lot of people messaging me on the Patreon asking, okay, should I trade for OBJ? What can I extend an offer out? And I would say I wouldn't even trade for OBJ. I think he's going to be a wide receiver 3. He might be like a Corey Davis, who is not necessarily that because Corey Davis has been injured, but maybe Corey Davis has really great weeks where he has like 20, 25 points, and then Odell have like, 6 points or 8 points. So I really wouldn't trust Odell in terms of fantasy. And it does degrade Robert Woods because he is going to be taking targets away. And the Rams know that if they signed Odell, they need to get him targets because that's what he's there for. So it is going to take away a little bit from Robert Woods and a tiny bit from Cooper Kupp. But if you have Cooper Kupp, don't be worried. Don't be like, oh, wait, now I should trade away Cooper Kupp for maybe Deebo Samuel because you said like he has great matchups. No, you're still keeping Cooper Kupp over Deebo Samuel because Cooper Kupp is on pace to be the best wide receiver in fantasy football ever. So you have to keep him on your team no matter what, unless you get an amazing offer like Kamara and Deebo Samuel, but nobody's going to do that. But I would say it downgrades Woods a little bit from a wide receiver 2 to like a wide receiver 3, depending on the matchup. But it's going to be interesting to see how they use him this week against the 49ers, Odell. But I wouldn't say you have to trade for Odell, but I also wouldn't say you have to trade away Woods because a lot of people, if you're trying to trade away Woods, he's not going to have much value because if you try to trade Woods away for a wide receiver, the person you're offering is going to be like, well, I don't want Woods now because Odell is there. So wait a week and maybe wait until this Monday night game and maybe the Rams still use Robert Woods. And then you could extend the trade offer and be like, oh, see, Odell was there and they still used Woods. So now would you accept this offer? But I wouldn't pick up. I wouldn't even pick up or trade for Odell.
So he is active this week for the Monday night?
Right. Yeah, he should definitely play, but how much is he going to be involved learning the playbook and stuff? I don't know.
Damn. I thought I had one more week with Robert Woods. like one more like solid week.
Yeah.
I mean, they use him in like jet sweeps and like running the ball. So
yeah, he did have a rushing touchdown the other week. So
yeah, it's possible they could still keep him in the main rotation. And how long will it take Odell to fit into the playbook?
Right, exactly.
Let's move on. We're going to tight ends.
Yep. So next is tight ends, and before it's kind of similar to the running back situation. I don't want to give you guys I don't want to focus on the top guys. So obviously there's 5 top tight ends. There's Kelsey, Waller, Kittle, Andrews, and Pitts. So if you have one of those 5 guys, then you shouldn't really listen to what I have to say, because those guys have good matchups and you're starting them no matter what. I mean, they all have decent matchups both weeks, but if you have them, you're not trying to trade them away. If you have them, you're keeping them, you're starting in week 16 and 17 for the fantasy football playoffs and finals, no matter what.
What if you got two of them?
You, you have two. So you have a good opportunity to trade one away for one of the other players I said in one of the other segments. But like the running backs, I'm going to try to give you guys some tight ends that aren't on the radar. Maybe, lower tier guys that have great matchups that could have great games in the fantasy football playoffs. So if you don't have one of the top 5 tight ends that I mentioned, then try to get one of these 3. I actually have 3. I don't have 5 players that I like. I have 3 tight ends that I like. So if you don't have one of those 5 that I mentioned, the top 5, then try to get one of these 3 on your team before the playoffs. So the first one is TJ Hockenson. I talked about that Falcons and Lions game in week 16. I think it's going to be high scoring. I like Matt Ryan. I like Pitts. I like Hockenson. I like Swift in that game. And then also Hockenson and the Lions play Seahawks in week 17. So good matchups there. I think those both are going to be high scoring. Both teams get into the 20s. So I like Hockenson. Number 2 is Logan Thomas. Now, he has been injured. He should be coming back soon. He was activated off IR, I think. Week 15, he plays the Eagles, who give up the first most fantasy points to tight ends. Week 16, he plays the Cowboys, who give up the 13th most fantasy points to tight ends. And then week 17, he actually gets the Eagles again, who give up the most fantasy points to tight ends. So you might be saying, well, Washington football team, and they're playing the Cowboys and the Eagles, both divisional games. So how did Logan Thomas do against both of those teams last year? Because he played them 2 times each. Well, the first is the Cowboys. He played the Cowboys twice last year, obviously. 16 points in the first game, 12 points in the second game, scored a touchdown in both of those. And then against the Eagles last year, he got 13.7 fantasy points and 12.7 fantasy points. Both touchdowns and a touchdown in both of those games. So every time he plays these teams, he gets a touchdown. So that's good sign for Logan Thomas. Try to get him on your team. And then again, he plays the Eagles in week 15 as well. So if you're looking to get into the playoffs, or if you have extended playoffs in your league and you need week 15 matchup to be good, then you got Logan Thomas there. And then staying in the same division, Dallas Goedert. I like him now that Ertz is gone. Goddard's getting all the targets. Week 16, he plays the Giants. They give up the 18th most fantasy points to tight ends. And then week 17, he plays Washington, who give up the 12th most fantasy points to tight ends. And last year against the Giants, he missed the first game they played. The second game, he didn't have a great game, 7.3 fantasy points, but that's also because Ertz was there. And then in week 17, Ertz didn't play against Washington last year. So in the first game against Washington, Goddard had 24.1 fantasy points. And then the second game, he was ruled out due to an injury. So I like Goddard, both divisional matchups, both pretty good matchups for them. And then 2 players I dislike. One is Dalton Schultz. He plays Washington in week 16, 12th most fantasy points to tight end. So that's actually not a bad matchup. But then in week 17, he plays the Cardinals. They give up the second least fantasy points to tight ends. And then Mike Gesicki, I really don't love him. I would try to trade him away if you have him. We saw he laid a goose egg the other night against the Ravens. In week 16, he plays the Saints. They give up the 6th least fantasy points to tight ends. And then in week 17, he plays the Titans. They give up the 4th least fantasy points to tight ends. So I would be concerned about Gesicki after the goose egg. Hopefully you could try to get some value for him, but I would be fine with you trading away Gesicki and getting somebody like TJ Hockenson, or maybe Logan Thomas if you wait a week and make sure that Thomas is back. But even Gesicki for Dallas Goedert, any of those 3 guys that I mentioned, or any of the top 5 guys, if you can get any of them, which is unlikely, but that's my feeling for tight ends.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah, you're in luck because Jonathan, who you're facing this week, started Gesicki, laid a goose egg. Should be an easy win for you.
I know. That's for first place. We're both 8-1, so this is for sole possession. It's been a hyped up matchup, so I think I can win it now that Gesicki got 0 and Justin Tucker only got 4 or 5, I think.
You got 5, yeah.
5.
I saw you were starting Kamara. Is he good to go for this week?
Well, he didn't practice Wednesday or Thursday. We have yet to see about Friday. Hopefully he plays. The thing is, if he doesn't practice on Friday, there's been reports that there's not a lot of optimism that he plays if he doesn't practice on Friday. So he might not practice on Friday and they might be like, oh, he's a game time decision. Then I would lean towards the fact that he's not going to play. Now, I do get lucky because I do have Dalvin Cook and Zeke, and I also have Mixon, but Mixon is on a bye. So I might have to pick somebody up, or I might have to put somebody in my flex. I think I have I have CeeDee Lamb in my wide receiver 2 spot, and I have Michael Pittman on my bench. So if I have to move Zeke into the RB spot and put Pittman at flex, I'm not too worried about that. But my guess is that Kamara will practice on a limited basis Friday and then still play on Sunday.
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, that's a 6-man league. I bet people are like, how in the world do you have that many good players?
Yeah.
6-man league. That's why. That's why. All right. Last one. Defense. Defense wins championships. Is that true for fantasy?
Defense does. I mean, you might be sitting there and you're like, well, why would I really care about getting a defense that has a good matchup in fantasy playoffs? But I mean, that could be the difference between getting 8 fantasy points and getting 15. And when it's the fantasy football playoffs, those 5 to 7 points could matter a lot. So I'm going to give you 4 defenses that I like and 2 that I don't like. So the first is the Buccaneers. They play the Panthers in week 16. Like I said, they give up the 5th most fantasy points to defenses. And then in week 17, they play the Jets. That's obviously a great matchup. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing defenses. Number 2 is the Seahawks. In week 16, they play the Bears. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to defenses. And then week 17, they play the Lions. They give up the 6th most fantasy points to defenses. Number 3 is the Chargers. They play at the Texans in week 16, give up the most fantasy points to opposing defenses. And then in week 17, they play the Broncos at home. They give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. The 4th is the Saints. They play the Dolphins at home in week 16. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. And then in week 17, they play at home against the Panthers. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. And I like the Packers. The Saints are much better when they play at home. So getting those home games for the fantasy football playoffs against Dolphins and Panthers, great matchups for their defense. Now, 2 teams that I don't like. I actually don't like the Rams matchups. In week 16, they play at the Vikings. They give up the 5th least fantasy points to opposing defenses. And then they play the Ravens in week 17. They give up the 17th least fantasy points to opposing defenses. So what I want to say here is if you have the Rams defense, I would try to trade them away. And maybe you could pick up one of the 4 defenses that I mentioned for the fantasy football playoffs. I mean, Chargers and Seahawks should be available because they're not top tier defenses, but trading away the Rams, once they just got Von Miller, a lot of people in your league, a lot of teams in your league are probably like, oh my gosh, I want the Rams defense. They're going to be so good. Take advantage of that because now that you know that the Rams don't have great matchups in week 16 and 17, and you could just pick up the Seahawks or Chargers, trade away the Rams defense, and you could trade away, a receiver, maybe Brandon Cooks or Justin Jefferson, trade away one of your receivers and the Rams defense for like a Deebo Samuel or DJ Moore or DK Metcalf or DeAndre Hopkins, using that to your advantage that these playoffs matchups are happening and your opponent might not know that. And then the other team I don't like is the Cardinals defense, another top tier defense that you might want to trade away because they're probably rostered in your league. They most likely are. They play the Colts in week 16. They give up the 9th least fantasy points to opposing defenses. And then they play at the Cowboys in week 17. They give up the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing defenses. And that Cowboys-Cardinals game is going to be high scoring, and I would not trust the Cardinals there. And then a notable that I do want to talk about is the New England Patriots. I have them in all my fantasy leagues. And in week 16, they play the Buffalo Bills, and I'm not going to start them in any of my leagues. I actually picked up the Chargers against the Texans in week 16 to start instead. So in my leagues, that's my strategy. I wanted to let you guys know, but my strategy is I have the New England defense in all my leagues. And except for our 16 league, actually, I have the Rams, but I'm about to drop them because somebody else can have them. I don't care. But in the other 3 leagues, I have the Patriots. And I know in week 17, they play the Jaguars. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing defenses. And the Patriots are at home at Gillette. So in week 17, I know I'm starting the Patriots in the fantasy football finals. Hopefully I make it there. I know I'm starting them and they're going to have a great game. But then they play the Bills in week 16. So I need to look for a good matchup. So I found the Chargers. In week 16, they play the Texans, who give up the most fantasy points to opposing defenses. So in those leagues that I have the Patriots, I picked up the Chargers defense. And for the rest of the season, I'm rolling with them because in all my leagues, I think in our league, I'm tied for first. And after this week, I'm going to be in first. In my other 12 team, I'm undefeated. My other 12 team, I'm tied for, or I'm in second. And then my other 10 team league, I'm in first. So I know I'm going to make the fantasy football playoffs. I'm just prepping for that time. So then in week 16 in the fantasy football semifinals, I have the Chargers against the worst offense. Like the Texans give up the most fantasy points to defenses. And then in week 17, I have the Patriots against the Jaguars give up the third most fantasy points to opposing defenses. So I know I'm set for defense. Just prepping, that's what this whole podcast is about, prepping you guys for the fantasy football playoffs. And this advice is mostly for people who are leading their leagues. Now, Jared, you have less flexibility because you are in last or second to last in our 6-team league. So you need wins now. You still are trying to make the playoffs. So it's not like you could trade away Justin Jefferson for some of these other guys if they don't have great matchups, because you need wins now. Like you can't trade away Jefferson because Jamar Chase is on a bye. So you need Jefferson in your lineup now. But me sitting at the top of the league at 8-1, I know that I know I'm going to make the playoffs. So now at this point, I need to build the best lineup I can so that in week 15, I have the best matchups out of anybody else in the league, no matter who I match up against. So if you're first, second, third, fourth in your league and you think you're going to make the playoffs, now is the time to make these moves. And even if you're last or, towards the bottom, you could try to make some moves for these players because I think they have great matchups later in the season as well.
Mm-hmm. And we are in a 6-man league, so yes, I am like in last, but I only need to make 2 more spots to get in the playoffs.
Exactly. You just need to be one of the top 4. And I think the fourth place team is like not even at 500. I think they're like 4 and 5. So like you could still get there
easily. Yeah. If I have back-to-back good weeks, I could easily be in third or fourth place.
Right.
So. All right, so that wraps up the playoff segment. We're going to move on to the weekly picks and must-sits. But before we do that, I just want to promote the Patreon and John's TikTok live show. So the Patreon, I'll leave a link down in the description. You can either pay $1 a week, $2 a week, or $5 a week to get more personalized fantasy football advice from John. As you know, for the TikTok live, he posts his weekly picks and his must-sits. If you can't make that, John posts his weekly picks and must-sits on the Patreon. So if you're busy during that time between noon and 1 o'clock and you can't make the live, then the Patreon's for you. You can go on and he will post it around 11:45 right before the live. And you can see that. And you can also just get personalized content throughout the week. And the TikTok live is Sunday at noon Eastern Standard Time. He does the weekly picks, the must-sits. He also does weekly rankings. And just throughout, he does the Q&A segment where he just answers everybody's questions, just rapid fire. Probably answers like 1,000 freaking questions.
Yeah.
So make sure you look out for that. Oh, I just hit my elbow. God, my funny bone.
Funny bone. That hurts.
Yeah, so I wanted to tell you guys about that before we get into the weekly picks and the must-sits. So I know, John, you probably don't have any specifically, but who are you looking out for your weekly picks?
So the players for my weekly picks that I'm looking out for, I have a bunch of them. Again, Christian Kirk, I said him last week. He had 16 to 17 fantasy points. I think when he threw that touchdown or that pass, they put him on a sweep, and I think he threw the ball and they marked it down at like the 1-inch yard line. But I think he got the passing touchdown there, which is unfortunate. He didn't get the points for that. But I like Kirk. I don't think Kyler's going to play. I don't think Hopkins is going to play. AJ Green is back. So I don't love Kirk this week. I don't think he's going to have over 25 points. He might be one of my weekly picks, but he might be a flex consideration if you're deciding between him and somebody else. Number 2 is Ramondre Stevenson / Brandon Bolden. Now, Stevenson and Damian Harris were knocked out of last week's game for the Patriots with concussions. Stevenson is expected to practice on Friday. Damian Harris isn't. So it seems like Stevenson is going to lead the Patriots backfield against the Browns. But if he doesn't play, then it would be Brandon Bolden and J.J. Taylor, and I like Brandon Bolden. Now, I'm not saying start these guys over top or even mid-tier players, but if you're in a 12, 14-team league and you're looking for a running back to throw in, they could be an option. Number 3 is Deontay Harris. I posted him on one of my TikTok videos on Tuesday. He plays the Titans this week. They give up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And he's been the highest targeted player in the Saints offense the last 2 weeks. So I actually picked him up in my 12-man league because Jamar Chase is on a bye. So I have Deontay Harris in my lineup there. Obviously, D'Ernest Johnson, if Chubb doesn't play, you guys know that D'Ernest Johnson is a must start because he's playing the Patriots. The way to attack them is on the ground. And last time we saw D'Ernest Johnson start, he did great against the Broncos. And then CeeDee Lamb or Amari Cooper against the Falcons. I haven't dove into which one I'm going to choose yet. I'm probably leaning more towards CeeDee Lamb if I do choose one of them, only because he was targeted way more than Amari Cooper last week. And he was actually targeted down the field. Dak just missed on him a couple times. So I do like CeeDee Lamb. Deontay Johnson against the Lions. Chase Claypool did get injured. He might not play this week against the Lions. And if that's the case, I think Deontay Johnson is going to have a great game because they're going to have to target him a lot. But also, I'm watching the Roethlisberger injury because he didn't practice on Wednesday. Mike Evans against Washington is the next guy. Antonio Brown is ruled out for this week. Rob Gronkowski is ruled out for this week. Chris Godwin is a game time decision. That just tells you that Mike Evans is just, that's like screaming that Mike Evans is going to have a blow up game. So I don't know if I want to choose him as one of my weekly picks because it kind of seems too obvious, but we'll see. I'll see if Godwin plays or not. But if you have Evans, he has to be in your lineup against Washington. And then Kenyon Drake against the Chiefs. That should be a higher scoring game. And Drake actually has been targeted a lot in the passing game. He had over 15 fantasy points last week against the Giants. So I do like Drake. And then from that Washington and the Bucks team, Tyler Johnson. If Chris Godwin doesn't go, I think Tyler Johnson could get close to 10 targets. I think he had 6 targets last week. He had 11.8 fantasy points last week. So I think without Gronk, without Antonio Brown, and if Godwin doesn't play, the Washington football team, if Mike Evans doesn't have over 30 fantasy points, I'd be shocked. But then Brady's going to have to throw to somebody else on some of the plays. So I think it could be Tyler Johnson.
Okay, so we're going on to the must sits now.
So must sits, I have 6 players, and obviously none of these are final, but the first is Jalen Hurts against the Broncos. Again, the Broncos have been pretty good against opposing quarterbacks last week against Dak. The only points that Dak had were in garbage time. Number 2 is Courtland Sutton. The Eagles have been great against opposing receivers. Last week, one of my must-sits was Mike Williams. He only had 7 or 8 fantasy points. Courtland Sutton should be matched up on the outside against Darius Slay, which is not a great matchup, so I would be really careful about Sutton. I'd rather Judy in this game. Number 3 is Michael Pittman. Now, that's the biggest surprise. Now, I'm not saying he's probably not going to be one of my must-sits, but I would say temper your expectations. 2 weeks ago, I chose him as my weekly pick against the Titans, had over 30 fantasy points. Last week, against the Jets on Thursday night, he had like 17 fantasy points or something like that. Now, he plays the Jaguars. It's a great matchup, but I would be careful because T.Y. Hilton is coming back this week. So, or he's expected to come back this week. And when he played last, he led the team in targets. It wasn't Pittman that led the team in targets. It was Hilton when he played last. So I would be careful about Pittman. That's why in my league, in our 6-team league, I have Cooper Kupp and I'm starting CeeDee Lamb over Michael Pittman because T.Y. Hilton is expected to come back. Now, obviously, if Kamara doesn't play, I'd be fine with throwing Pittman into my flex, but I'm just saying temper your expectations. And if you're in a 6 or 8-team league, consider sitting Pittman this week. Number 4 is Michael Carter against the Bills. The Bills have been great against the run game. Michael Carter has been hyped up a lot, had that great game against the Bengals last week against the Colts, only had like 10 fantasy points. So I would be careful with him against the Bills. And then Elijah Moore, also on the Jets, had that blow-up game, his best game of his career so far against the Colts on Thursday night, around 27 fantasy points. But I would be careful about him this week because Corey Davis might come back, and it's the Bills. Tre'Davious White he might be matched up against. So I would be careful because the Bills have been great against receivers this year. And then the last is Kyler Murray. Even if he plays against the Panthers, I would be careful about starting him. I like some other quarterbacks better. So just be careful about that injury with Murray. I don't think he is going to play, but if he does, maybe consider throwing in your backup.
Amazing. So this is probably our longest podcast, but it's definitely one with the most content, probably the best content that you can get.
Right.
So we went through QBs, running backs, receivers, tight ends, defense for playoffs, and then the weekly picks. and the must sits. Is there anything else that you could fit in just maybe a minute that you could think of?
I don't think so. I mean, how many times did I say this most fantasy points to this position,
Oh my
this
gosh.
least? It was like,
If I had time, I would like list it out for everybody like
yeah,
visually, but you're just gonna have to remember it. You're just gonna have to write it down as he's talking. Pause
I
the
know.
video, do what you can. Like,
I wish I could show you guys, like send you a picture of like my note sheet, but it's like covered like front to back with like just names and numbers everywhere. So if I had your phone number, I would text you guys a picture of it so you could
yeah,
reference it. But
maybe put it in the Patreon.
yeah, I should.
That's funny. All right, well that wraps it up. So as I said before, the Patreon will be linked down in the description, and make sure you look out for John's live show on TikTok. It goes from noon to around 12:45, 12:50. And be on the lookout for the Dorm Debate podcast, which we post every week on Thursdays. So we posted one this Thursday, but it should be labeled Mid-Season Awards. So we went through that. It was a really good episode. Hopefully you guys tune in for that one. So thank you guys again for joining us, and hopefully you guys win your weeks this week, and we will see you guys next week.